So beyond the Jesus seminar, I was joking with a friend today about the name of this particular class is perhaps a bit of a misnomer, since I haven't really gone as beyond it, perhaps as the description indicated. I've actually done the first 3 weeks. We spent time talking about what the Jesus seminar folks actually did do and some of their conclusions. And we essentially walked through that content. And tonight, I'm actually going to do a little bit more history for context, and then take our first step at looking at some of the trajectories from the Jesus seminar. So if you haven't joined us, if this is your first time with us, in terms of new information, it's not like you've missed anything, but I think it's been useful, these first 3 classes. So tonight, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cover a brief overview of the quests, because there were depending on how you number them, there were 3. Some people refer to the non-quest in between 1 and 2 as a separate, non-quest was a quest. Anyway, whatever. But scholars tend to talk about 3 different quests for the historical Jesus. So we'll talk about those briefly, partly because it does help to set the framework for why these conversations, even in the 21st century, are still relevant, still needing to be had. Also, then talk briefly about the main trajectories from the Jesus seminar. And we did talk about these briefly on the first night, but I'm going to talk about them again, just briefly to touch on them. When we talked about them on the first night, I was more or less asking you all, those who were there, if they were interested in learning more about any of those particular seminars that were spin-off, that came out of the energy and the focus of the Jesus seminar, not specifically on Jesus scholarship, but you'll see in a moment. And I think some folks indicated they were interested, but what I don't think I made really clear is that all of those other seminars, in a sense, were possible because of the work that had been done. And this is one of the things we've been talking about, essentially, is the legacy of the Jesus seminar. What kinds of things, intellectually, academically speaking, did it make possible? And so that's why we'll just do a quick touch on that. And then the third part is looking at or talking about Christian origins, the way that realm of scholarship has been reignited, I suppose you could say, with some new perspectives and some new information, new fodder behind it. So 3 quests. The first, as you can see, is referred to as the old quest because it was first, and there have been newer ones since. So if you can imagine, first of all, that a time when this, at least in terms of what was being written down and therefore disseminated and studied or learned by men in the church, the leaders in the church, that up until this point, I'm going to actually do the next slide because, 1778, okay? Up until that point, we didn't have people specifically wrestling with these issues or making it something that's relevant to the church, not just scholars, but that it's something that's relevant to, something that's relevant to understanding who Jesus was. Source criticism, when you talk about source criticism, it is what it sounds like. What are the sources that people believe were being used by the gospel writers? And this is the first time that people were specifically trying to point out, we have different audiences. I should say most recently, because I think it's not fair to say that no one in the prior 1700 years had that thought. I don't think that's reasonable, but we're having this renewed interest, and that's the framework of the work that was going on in this particular set of conversations. So But what we do have is this, what is new is this distinction, is someone making a distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And you can tell, because if you read any of the men of the, or women in church history, they aren't making that distinction, right? And for the Christian tradition, for the inheritance, right, of the Christian tradition, the human and the divine, which is what we're doing when we make a distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, they were intertwined. I mean, that's what one of the first big ecumenical council was about, right? Is how to make sense of this claim of Jesus as human and divine. So it makes sense to me, right, that in terms of tradition, this distinction hadn't been made. And it is one of the hallmarks of the quests is raising this observation. And now let's dive into that. And therefore, it should not be a surprise to anyone that is, again, the primary hang-up for more conservative people with the quests of any of them, whether it's the first or the third. And most conservatives really only know about the most recent one, and that's fine. But the idea of being able to separate the human who actually walked, and put on pants in the morning, versus the Christ who is the divine, that is a theologically challenging conversation to have. So that's the big, kind of the takeaway on the first quest, is this initial stance, making this observation clear, right? It isn't that others haven't noticed it. Is there a comment or question?
I'm sorry I threw a wrinkle in that. I thought you'd put that on your calendar or something because you're always so organized.
Oh. I'm not sure who that was.
Oh, are you gonna be able to take Ben skiing?
I'm not sure who that. Okay, I'm
Carolyn.
Okay, good. Okay. I do, I haven't personally read on the intention of Jesus and his disciples, but this, kind of simmering down by Reimarus, suggesting that Jesus was a failed revolutionary, and the ideas about, resurrection and the empty tomb and all of that and the return, the parousia, being made up by his disciples. I mean, I'm sure you can appreciate why that would seem pretty radical, and might have been dismissed by people within the Christian tradition. It is still an idea that is dismissed by people in the Christian tradition to make that claim, right? So we could also, I'm a little bit more in tune today with the United States government and political machinations and how those events influence people of faith or influence the needs for conversations, right? I don't think the timing of this is a coincidence. Note the date of the writing of this particular book and the start of this particular quest, 1778. Someone raising a flag, raising a point, raising an observation, something, there may be a critical conversation to be had here, folks. I don't think that's a coincidence, the timing-wise. Noted. Okay. Griesbach and the four-source hypothesis or theory came into play in this first quest. So I imagine most of you are familiar with the four-source theory. If you've done any studies around the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, the first three that we talk about as the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are just two different ways to help explain what sources were being used. And the four source is the one that I teach in classes. I imagine it's one that most of you are familiar with, but it's a way of saying Mark came first, Matthew and Luke used Mark. There's this other thing called Q, which is the collection of sayings that Matthew and Luke share. So that's the second source. And then Matthew has its own source of stories and Luke has its own source of stories. So that's four sources that help create the three synoptics. The Griesbach is simply a two source, which is a way of saying it, which suggests that Matthew was written first, Luke used it and redacted it, or that's a modern use of redaction. Redaction when it comes to anyway, Luke used Matthew and edited it. And Mark, which is shorter, the shortest of the three, Mark used both Matthew and Luke and just further condensed, which is a really, obviously my bias is showing already, right? I'm showing my bias, which I try not to do too much, but that isn't usually how humans function. We don't normally want to shorten a story that's about such an important person. We normally tend to expand upon it. I saw that Kate raised her hand. I don't know where Kate is here. Kate, did you have a comment or question?
So, I know about Q, right? And so there's like Mark and Matthew and Luke, right? But Luke, to my understanding, was like this like veterinarian who was like really good at Greek. And I just don't understand a lot of things about why people think that what's in Mark might be in Luke. You know what I mean?
Well, the difference between what Luke specifically adds, so what comes out of the source that we would call L, so the stories that
I thought we called that source Q.
No, Q is the source that has the source of stories that Matthew and Luke share that just are not found in Mark. So anything that, in particular, the way that Luke is different from the other two, so whether Luke adds things, the way Luke pairs stories, the types of stories that are added into the gospel, have this kind of hint of familiarity with bodies, whether human or animal. I think more people suggest the human part, but regardless, the reason he has this doctor affiliation or association is because of this predominance of concerns about bodily health and the bodily needs and things. So it's a creation of the early church to refer to him as a doctor. And then many people just hung on to that. When you actually boil it down, there isn't that much more of an emphasis in Luke than in other gospels. So this is yet another example of people, wanting to make a big thing out of a small anecdote or whatever.
So you don't think that Luke was maybe actually a veterinarian?
No, I don't think so. So this is an interesting line of questioning. I do want to actually not spend a whole lot of time talking about the synoptics right now, if that's okay. I don't think I actually have I don't have a particular image in my head of Luke. I think I'm more interested in thinking about the ideas that he does that are promoted in Luke's gospel, in particular the social justice stuff. But okay, thanks. So back to this first quest, just to wrap this one up. We do have a handful of more than just, these two guys. We have a handful of definitions or images of who Jesus was that come out of the first quest. For whatever reason, Albert Schweitzer, his comments about this search are, I don't know why, maybe, am I the only one who wants to associate Schweitzer with Mark Twain? I don't know. I have this, for some reason,
looks like him.
Maybe that was it. I don't know. Thanks, Harriet. I appreciate that. I'm not sure what it is, but it's also, I think the writing of Schweitzer's that I did read, I guess I read a biography about him, and some of his writings, there's something really, he just had a very keen sense of observation. And he's the one who made this made the comment about how the search for the historical Jesus is akin to looking down into a well, right? Each depiction of him essentially comes out of who the person is who's who's trying to get at the depiction. So that comes at the beginning of the 20th century, is this comment about, really, our interest in being objective is noted, but it's impossible, right? And so you have, some of the guys in this first quest are making this observation. Is it possible to be objective? Like, we're trying to say we should separate the two, but I'm not sure that we can be separate these two, the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. And then what kinds of observations are we going to be able to make in it at all? And so I think Schweitzer's observation applies to all of the quests. And I think I've made this comment actually in at least one of the previous weeks, right? That it's not a surprise that Dick Horsley talks about the social activist element of the Gospels, because Dick Horsley, right, was marching in the 60s and 70s. Like that's who he is, he's just, the guy can't sit still. He's got so much energy and so much urgency about making a difference in the world, and John Dominic Crossan is one of the most gentle humans I've ever met. And, his depiction of Jesus is much still insightful, but it's much gentler, I would say. So we connect with or make sense of or understand, resonate with various parts of what we're seeing. I'm seeing some chatter, and I don't know if I need to. Oh, nope. Good. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the second quest. And I don't have as much to say about it. The no quest that I mentioned is sometimes 1B, which was happening during the foment leading up to World War I and then immediately after. So I think on some level, and all through World War II, right? So there's perhaps understandable gap there, in particular because more of the scholars at that point, right, were on the European continent. So the new quest, the second quest, came after World War II, and yes, was spurred on by an urgency about the theological issues that undergirded. It's not the only, obviously, not the only motivation, but a stunningly underappreciated element of the Holocaust, the theological inheritance, right? That beliefs about Jews and Judaism in the mid 20th century, early 20th century didn't come out of a vacuum. So that, as well as whatever element of guilt over it and the need for creating Israel, so forth, obviously complicated, but that's the motivation here, right? As well as perhaps you could say this discovery of new documents, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library. So both are perhaps collections of more, not extremist, although I would say that the Qumran scrolls come out of a much more extremist mindset. They're community. Obviously the scrolls are copies of scriptures or are their own communal laws and regulations. So it's not, but there's still an element of the eschatological or the apocalyptic going on in those writings. So their interests, right, showed up in what they did collect. But the problem of the historical Jesus, really what Kaisman was trying to get at there is commenting on the impossibility of being objective. That's all. It's not like he's trying to, I think it might sound much more critical than I think what he was trying to say is. But this is where we got the initial venture into creating some criteria for if we want to try to separate the two, if we want to try to get back to these words that this guy Jesus would have spoken. What criteria would we use for that? So, and Strauss, who I think is, I do believe that Marcus did he dedicate the 5 Gospels? He dedicated something, one of his books. I think it's the work of, anyway, to Strauss, who was a part of the second quest, and this creating of criteria for authenticity. So I don't need to tell you all, the folks at Trinity Episcopal, about the third quest, as you are Trinity Episcopal and beyond. You're familiar with what's going on. But yes, we did have this renewed interest in, or perhaps a heightened interest in the Judaism of Jesus, both his history and his context, his identity. So that became a central focus, not during the second quest, interestingly enough, right? But because it took some time, I think, for Christians to be able to acknowledge publicly that Jesus actually was a Jew. It's still shocking for some people, right? To some people in Christian traditions to be told that Jesus was a Jew, or for them to sit with that and to make sense of that. Just like it's shocking for, I had people laugh. I had biblical scholars laugh at me when I made a comment about Paul not being a Christian. So it's a real thing. One of the things I do find I wanted to chat with you about, or really maybe I should say, I wanted to hear your thoughts about, is this question: can one only discuss the historical aspect of Jesus without dealing with or affecting theological claims about him as well? I'm wondering what your thoughts are in response to that question.
One of my struggles has been with the fact that our creeds eliminate the historical Jesus. And so that has been a mental challenge for me, because I am really enjoying the historical Jesus.
I appreciate that, Ken. I appreciate that observation and that comment. Carolyn, did you want to chime in?
Yes, I think it's very difficult to discuss the historical aspect of Jesus without dealing with theological claims about him. But on the other hand, I feel like I can look at the historical Jesus and put aside the theological claims and also all the Christology that has been developed in 2,000 years of Christianity. And I find that kind of liberating, actually.
Liberating to be able to set that aside?
Yes, to be able to set aside all that other stuff and just look at the historical Jesus. And I guess where I come from is I have a strong affinity to Hebrew scripture, and I have a strong affinity to Judaism. And so I tend to look at the historical Jesus as a Jew, and as a Jew who was observant, okay, and not to put all that other stuff on him that we've inherited in 2,000 years of Christianity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I love the tradition. That's why I'm a staunch Episcopalian.
There is power in ritual and tradition.
Oh, I love the ritual. I'm a connection. Ritualist.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
But I can separate the two. The ritual and the historical.
Okay.
And I tend to err always on the side of the historical Jesus who lived and died a Jew.
Okay, Martha.
Okay, so, yeah, no, thanks. So I'm a lapsed Episcopalian, but I'm thinking that this question about the theology and the history, first off, I think it's more interesting to separate them and then put them back together. I mean, I just think that's interesting, but I feel like in order to put them back together, I'm going to have to separate them pretty far before I can do that. But it makes me also want to then go back to, like the Council of Nicaea and some of the early history pieces to see how the theology evolved. But that means stripping away everything and getting the history piece separate from some of the mess that ended up. Anyway, I think it's interesting.
I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm appreciating your comments. You said the mess that ended up. I mean, the ideas, the complicated, quite complex theological claims were hard to. I mean, they spent a couple hundred years after deciding it how to make sense of it, right? And it took 300 to get to the idea that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. I mean, in terms of doctrine. So you're actually, it's interesting, and part of what I'm hearing in you all is what is one of the pieces that came out of the work done by the Jesus Seminar, which is, the longer we sit with these things, the more apparent it becomes to some people that the guy Jesus really, that person, positing that there was just one person that we're pointing back towards, and I'm fine to just do that, right? That person actually doesn't fully explain the Christian tradition, because what develops in what we call the Christian tradition is a lot of ideas that are piled on top of the person. You've got a human being who's turned into a hero, turned into a god, right? And theological claims about a human, it might happen relatively quickly, but that is an indication of a development of thought. So and I see that there's some folks who want to comment or chime in, and I want to get to you, but I'm going to come back to this in a minute as well, but I don't know if that's what you're conscious of what you're saying, but that is part of what I'm hearing is, okay, I'm realizing that I've been thinking about this as all one thing, but I can acknowledge that the guy who was executed by Romans is different from the guy who's exalted into the heavens. And that's because there's several decades, or in the case of the creeds, several centuries that have given us the development of thought. I think there's another hand. I have a handful, just 4, of the scholars who were involved in this third quest. I didn't leave Borg off on purpose. It was more of I had these in my notes, and I noticed for myself actually that prior to 15 years ago, when I was preparing for a course on the portrayals of Jesus, Borg loomed large even then in terms of the segment of the scholarship and the field. So I'm sure that you all are familiar with, what he was up to, and how instead of just these, what can we say about what he said and did? Yeah, my understanding is that Marcus was interested in what kind of guy was he, right? That's maybe the language that he brought to the conversation, and you're familiar with him. But we have these interesting claims being made at the end of the 20th century, in the 1990s. These scholars who are making quite a range of claims about Jesus in a kind of an essential way, that this is who he was, right? He was an eschatological prophet, although that Borg did not agree with that, because Borg thought that was actually not a part of what the real guy Jesus was up to. He was a Hasid, as in a Hasidic Jew, which is, again, another interesting thing to say, right, about a Jew in the first century, given the concept of Hasidim is much more modern. Anyway, so we have more claims being made about who this guy was. So the trajectories that I wanted to talk about, let's look at the other West Star seminars. When I look at the scholarship that was being produced, during the mid 90s into the first decade of 2000, the content on Paul absolutely is a spin-off of this renewed interest in talking about these people, or this movement. In this case, when we're talking about Paul, the Paul Seminar, looking at Paul, can we look at Paul from, can we sort through the differences between the theological claims and the things he's saying, and what do we know that this guy was up to? And so the interest in archaeological finds, the interest in the footsteps of Paul, those kinds of things come out of that, right? The Acts of the Apostles, that's where you'll find these prolonged conversations about the anti-Jewishness of the book of Acts, the anti-Jewishness of the Newer Testament taken as a whole, but in particular, this concern about the unquestioned reliance on the book of Acts as a historical document, instead of seeing it as what it was, which is a really interesting redefinition or spin, or redefining of what happened early on. These two different seminars, one on Christian origins and then one on Christianity. So the two different things, both focusing on the first 200 years. But the Christian origins is simply those folks were simply trying to understand, how did Christianity actually come about? Whereas the Christianity seminars trying to talk about, those folks were interested in talking about what Christianities looked like in those first 200 years. So two different interests there. So what I'm going to be talking about comes from this, essentially is, I guess you could say, inherits maybe, or is a part of this Christian origins collection, if you will. Quite a bit of, there's a greater influence of secular mindedness in these conversations, specifically in the Christian origins conversation. And then a reminder, really, that there are two seminars that are current, right? The continuation of the Christianity seminar, which is where that is right now. So moving into the 3rd and 4th centuries, looking at what did Christianities, plural, look like. And this God and the Human Future is about having active conversations, bringing in radical theologians, bringing in theologians, queer theologians, bringing in, theologians who are wanting to, essentially continue to break the mold of traditional ideologies, right? And in fact, the newest faculty member at the University of Portland, her name is Dr. Brandy Daniels, who is a queer theologian, and she's a mover and shaker, and she's been asked to be a part of this particular seminar. She and I go for hikes together in Forest Park and elsewhere, and she's, we've had conversations about being actively involved, tangentially involved in that for her, and why she might or might not be a part of that specific collective. But so, I think that these collections of scholars and deeply invested lay folks, right? I think it's continuing an important bridge, right? Trying to make the bridge between purely intellectual academic ventures and meeting the general people, right, on the streets. So what I want to do in talking about Christian origins, I like to refer to this dear colleague's book. Oh, I actually have it, sorry, on the next slide. But here's what the cover looks like. Why Christianity Happened, a socio-historical account of Christian origins. So I'm going to talk about what he offers, what James puts into, kind of brings into the conversation. But before we do that, I think I've mentioned this each week, being asked to present what the afterlives of the Jesus Seminar are is actually quite daunting, because I have to essentially just put my finger down and say, let's talk about this, let's talk about that, let's talk about that. The trajectories are wide and varied. But it also means that I'm spending some time just not necessarily going deep, but looking through lots of different scholars' frameworks, where they're coming from, and the conversations that they want to invite people to consider. And one of the books that I've been playing around with is Displacing Christian Origins, Philosophy, Secularity, and the New Testament. And this is not for the average just general reader. It's quite theoretically dense, and he's working with Hegelian ideas throughout. So it's for those of you who are philosophically and theoretically quite adept, you might find this quite interesting, actually. But some of the, when you can wade through it, there are these moments, these comments. History for us, right, exists only from out of a present. So is it possible to have an objective thing to say about the historical Jesus? What are the shoulders we're standing upon? How objective were they? And when you have multiple layers of this interested interpreting of ideas and events, it becomes quite complicated. At the same time, he also quotes, I'm assuming this is a poet. Actually, I meant to look it up if this was a poet but whenever any new medium or human extension occurs, so I'm thinking about what that actually means, right? Whenever any new medium or human extension occurs, it creates a new myth for itself. Of course, that's touching on this issue of myth and what do we mean by myth, and academically speaking, what do we mean by the Christian myth? Burton Mack has written several pieces that I think are quite important along these lines. I imagine some of you are familiar with some of Burton Mack's work, who wrote the New Testament, the Christian myth. That is also something I've been reading through today. I found quite interesting and useful. But there's also, I do know that at least one of you have read Paula Fredrickson's Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And she includes a quote by, I believe he was a Jesuit from the 16th century who led missions into China. So Matteo Ricci is who's being quoted here, and I guess he's writing in his journals or writing something. It often happens that those who live at a later time are unable to grasp the point at which the great undertakings or actions of this world had their origin. And I, constantly seeking the reason for this phenomenon, could find no other answer than this, namely, that all things, and parenthetically, including those that at last come to triumph mightily, all things are at their beginnings so small and faint in outline that one cannot easily convince oneself that from them will grow matters of great moment. One of the things, I find that really compelling, because one of the things that I constantly find myself revisiting as I'm, studying these things and trying to find ways to talk productively about it with other people, is I find myself questioning what is our human deal about origins? Why do we? What's going on there? I think there are lots of things going on there, just to be clear. I don't think it's one particular thing. I think it's several things. But also when I see somebody either commenting or raising your hand, so I'll get to you in just a second, but also there is an interest, or perhaps because of the hindsight element being, 20 centuries into this, sense of talking about this as a thing that, talking about it much more condensedly. And therefore, there's an element of how that affects us psychologically. If we're talking about Jesus through the lens of 3rd, 4th, 5th century beliefs and claims about him, we're going to think of that guy differently. It sounds like I'm not really saying anything new or different, but coming to that reality and sitting with that time and time again, right? There's something shifts. And this is one of the questions that John asked on the first week, I think, was, how does this study affect the scholars? What does this affect for scholars? So did someone have maybe a comment or a question? Someone have their hand raised? Or talking about origins means we're being challenged, I think, to, here's what I'd like. I'd like for you all who are here this evening to get something, some nugget that is new for you in how you think about either who Jesus was or Christian origins themselves. I mean, that obviously is pretty big. Something new about why Christianity came to be, why Christianity developed. That would be ideal in my mind. Again, because I've been working on a couple different laptops. I had things over on my new one, and I forgot that I can't plug in my microphone to my new one yet. Blah blah blah. So I don't have the things set up. So I can send a link if you'd like, or send it to someone at Trinity if you'd like. These, I was going to post them in the comments, but I realized I don't have it typed out over here. But these are some books on the sociological approach to conversation about Christian origins. The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. And he has a very long, let's see if I can do this without there being a glare on it. There we go. Rise of Christianity.
It's really good.
Was that Carolyn?
Janet.
Yeah.
Good book.
Yeah, good book on origins. This comes from the late 90s. So all of these are in that, late 90s realm, but worth your read. And Stark and Essler's book, The First Christians in Their Social World, also a good read, helpful, by Philip Essler. And then I mentioned Dick Horsley earlier. I would recommend any of his scholarship, to be honest. I find it compelling, but the sociology in the Jesus movement by Continuum series by Richard Horsley. I can recommend that. So here's the question that James Crossley in his book is engaging as a starting point for what he's offering to having a new conversation about Christian origins. And that is this question that in a sense might actually just be flipping on its head something that you've just taken to be a given, right? Why did this sect of Judaism, which we now call Christianity, right? It became Christianity. Why did that sect of Judaism begin to include people who were not law observant? Why would they do that? Why would that even happen? Why would Judaism anywhere do that, right? I tend to hear people talking about it as a given. It's something that happened. And thank you, Paul, right, is kind of my playful comment there. I'm seeing some raised hands. Let's see what we have here. Martha, did you want to chime in?
I just wanted to ask, so the books that you're we're talking about, are they products of the Jesus Seminar series, or would you consider them as a a product of that scholarship?
In a sense, I think, yeah, I appreciate the clarification. You know, I was thinking this was the rise of Christianity came, I think this was 96. Yeah, this was 96. I think this made it to, this was published by a popular publisher. It's HarperCollins, right? You're going to get the fun stuff by Bart Ehrman and HarperCollins. You don't get, you know, and I mean fun in terms of it's more accessible. It's much more readable than something like this is, right? I think that this was possible because of the Jesus Seminar, right? Because of their extensive efforts to make scholarship accessible. That something like this, I'm not sure that this was necessarily a bestseller, but the fact that it was quite popular at the time, it may have become a bestseller, I'm not sure, right? But something put out by Harper San Francisco. So I think Rodney Stark was a member of the Jesus Seminar community in general. I don't think he was necessarily, you know, considered one of the foremost scholars on historical Jesus, but his work is sociological, right? Not historical Jesus. I'm sorry if you can hear my cats in the background. But Philip Esler was also, you know, these three guys were all having conversations with Jesus Seminar people, for sure, fellows. Whether or not they were active, I don't know if they were actually active as fellows of the Jesus Seminar. They may have been, I don't know for sure. But I do think of those as an outgrowth of, or perhaps made a little bit more possible because of. Does that answer your question, Martha?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. You know, James, I actually contemplated asking James if he would join us in our Zoom conference tonight. He's a dear colleague, but he does live in England, so I figured that was probably a little bit too much to ask him to do. 7 o'clock our time. But his response is, it was for social reasons. Now, does that shift anything for any of you?
And not considered that.
Can you say more about that, Harriet?
I'm wondering if, let's say, the Gentiles were drawn to Jesus because they were experiencing a lack in their lives and saw the observant Jews who were becoming Jewish Christians, saw that their lives were transformed, or at least in the process of being transformed, and they were curious about it.
Could I possibly chime in here?
Sure.
So I lived in Jerusalem, and I am a Catholic, and I am not a very observant Catholic. I have to tell you that what I learned from living in Jerusalem was that people had a deep respect for the idea, not the ideology, but the idea of a person sort of being deliberate. And I think that reigns true today. And so, to speak to your question, I am not necessarily answering that, but I'm speaking to it. And I'm saying to you, in our real lives here, which is where I think Jen is trying to take us, we can't live in this obsolete kind of vernacular, right?
Yeah.
We situate ourselves here.
Yeah.
And
sorry.
That's where I want to live.
Okay. I want to get back to this question though about trying to think through understanding of Christian origins, right? And this you know, what Harriet said was kind of what it was almost like I set Harriet up to say that. Like it was kind of, you know, like that was what I was hoping someone would say. Partly because that is how I hear people think about it and talk about it, is that I say this as a person who is still shifting the way I understand Christian origins, right? So I'm with you, right? And yet I'm trying to push the way I think about it. And to be honest, what Crossley says, and he, you know, would tweak some of his language, I think, because he calls Christians right off the bat, and I don't think he would do that now. I think he would call them a sect of Judaism, because we don't have Christian until the 2nd century. But anyway, there's so much about the way we have inherited thinking about Christian origins that we're not even necessarily conscious of. So let me come back to talking about the points that Crossley makes in this particular book, trying to, you know, just kind of boiling it all down. There's, it's essentially I believe it's his dissertation. So, you know, he's revved up and offering quite a bit there. But this is one of the questions, or one of the observations I wanted to pause and ask you all about. So he's making an observation about historical Jesus studies in general. And he's noticed, so let me tell you up front, actually, he doesn't disclose this in this particular book, but he comes from lower middle class or lower class in terms of his background and his upbringing. And so he launching into PhD work, you know, was something, I think he was the first in his family to go on for education at all, much less a PhD. So he brings to the table a non-religious upbringing and a background that absolutely identifies with the peasants in 1st century Galilee. You all tracking with me here?
Yeah.
So his observations, I tend to think, are worth just given a, you know, yeah. So he has at times perhaps more bracing observations about other scholars or about the field of biblical scholarship than someone else who has come from a Christian background and has become a scholar would have about the field. So the predominance of Christians in Newer Testament studies has prevented advances in the historical study of Christian origins and focused too heavily on history of ideas, as in what some of us have been saying this evening, and the history of ideas, the focus on our minds and ideas. And if you've taken any other classes with me, you know that this is a thing I like to talk about. The spiritualization of the gospel or of any of this is when we get into our heads and we start talking about ideas and beliefs instead of real life lived out issues, right? So Crossley has suggested that because of the predominance of Christians in Newer Testament studies, that has led to too heavy a focus on the history of ideas rather than on social and economic causal factors of the spread of Christianity. I'm very interested in your responses to his observations.
Wasn't that, I'm not sure if I'm totally following you, but wasn't that one of the things that Rodney Stark dealt with? He's a sociologist. He's not an archaeologist. He's not trying to prove the Bible and all this, you know. He focuses on the social history of that first century.
Mm-hmm.
You know, anything, the earthquakes, the Roman armies, the plagues,
Mm-hmm.
And how it spread Christianity. Even it couldn't have had the spread of Christianity, some say, without the Roman road system. Right.
Sure.
And
now, Janet, I want to push you personally as a person of faith to filter that in. How does that affect the way you understand what Christianity is? And this issue of the history of ideas versus anyway, I realized from several of your bodily movements here. That this isn't new to you, to most of you. I think maybe my question isn't clear. From what I hear you saying, Janet, this isn't new, right? You've been thinking about the sociological background here before, prior to this.
Recently, frankly, but earlier in my life, yeah.
Yeah.
And I went to Turkey with the Borgs, and I mean, it was wonderful.
Yeah.
Jennifer, for me, it raises the larger question in terms of why religions at all, right?
Can you say
Not
more
just
about
Christianity,
that? Okay.
right? So why is it that humans have religion? And is it social? Is it economic? What is it that drives us to that, whatever religion it is?
Okay.
Right? And some would say it's because the largest pain that we have is loneliness. And so to overcome our loneliness, we gather and we start to think about that whole thing. So it could be social, it could be economic, right? But at the heart is what interests me.
Okay.
Right? Not just Christianity.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean,
religion
that's
in
part
general.
of that. But so, the whole notion of what Crossley said is a social reason. I understand it in that context, right?
Okay.
Why do we gather? So
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
for me the bigger question.
Sure. Thank you, Detlef. Keith and Jonathan, did one or both of you want to?
I just, in the chat, I uploaded an article that was in the Daily Beast of all places by several contemporary Jewish scholars of Christian origins and Second Temple Judaism that's talking back to a New York Times article that more or less made Jesus out to have nothing to do with Judaism.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting article, but I think it's to get to the immediate question you're asking. I would agree, even though I have not read the book you're talking about, that by having people from other traditions doing research and talking about what might have been going on, that gives us a much deeper understanding of who Jesus probably was, and also how it is Christianity came to be. And at one level, this is a tradition that I've inherited, and it's kind of my duty to make peace with it.
I like that final comment.
I've lived in the Muslim world for a long time, and it's real clear to me I'm not a Muslim, and I don't mean that in any negative way. Those
Totally.
narratives are not my narratives.
It's not the way it's not the way you see it.
Right. The narratives that shape that culture are not the narratives that shaped my culture and who I am. So what I got to do is make peace with what I inherited, and this is what I inherited.
I like that.
I had an idea.
Yeah, please, Holly. Yeah.
To your earlier question, and it ties in with this slide as well.
Okay, good.
It's really difficult to keep the law. I mean, in daily life, it's very constraining. And if it's only one-dimensional, which it could be for some people at that time, it does not take into account social justice sometimes. And so one of the social, I guess, of his point that it was socially driven would be just the need from the heart, Detlef, to see your fellow person, your fellow neighbor and friend experience justice, and not just this very hard, fast law. That's one reason I think that it could have expanded. They could have expanded to the non-Jewish population.
Okay, yeah. The feminist in me and the critical biblical scholar in me wants to at least give a shout out on some level to the Jewish law on the level of social justice. But it was early, right? We get laws in the Hebrew Bible that were, some I think were written by people with more means than others, but some were pretty basic everyday issues that really did get at.
Oh, sure. No, I'm not saying we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
No, exactly.
But I'm saying that there may have been situations where some people in the Jewish tradition were looking at things too constrained. And Christianity would have offered an alternative to that had maybe a little more freedom and flexibility.
Okay, so I want to be a little bit of a hard ass right now, because I'm not convinced that Jesus was I'm not as convinced of your point, actually, as I used to be. And here's what I mean. We have evidence of rabbis who were progressive, and the prophetic tradition itself was about calling out too strict, being able to work the law to your benefit. I mean, that's what Jesus is doing when he confronts the Jewish leaders. They're fighting over how to interpret the scriptures, right? And I really personally don't want to give Jesus too much credit. I think he's building off of others' ideas more than he's not. And I want to be really careful about the anti-Jewish sentiment that comes from saying Christianity was a freedom that Judaism didn't have, because I'm not sure it's ultimately, at the end of I'm not comfortable with that claim. Maybe I should just say that, right? Another hand raised, Keith and Jonathan.
I was just going to say the article that I uploaded speaks directly to this particular issue.
Oh, great. Oh, great.
It's Zwettler, Amy Jill Levine, Paula Erickson, those folks saying, look, you basically telling Christians that a lot of what we've been told about Jesus is probably about how Jewish he is, but it was never framed that way. Yeah. And Holly, I hope I wasn't too harsh in my response. I have a desire to kind of correct a little bit.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
And I'm standing on my tiptoes right now. I'm like, we've all kind of inherited this practice. And you know what I'm saying? Like, so I sense that you have those beliefs. It's not like it's something you just came up with yourself. Like, you've heard that and that made sense. And I get that. I want to push us on that, just as Amy, Jill, and others are doing. And I appreciate you saying something, and I don't want my comment to like keep you from speaking up again. Okay. Thank you, Keith, for sharing that. And I do want to push forward a little bit here. Might not get through all 5 points because I wanted to talk. So this is the newer stuff. So as was it Janet? I'm sorry. Janet mentioned, several of you mentioned, this isn't new for you to look at socioeconomic issues, right, of the first century, or even to look at specifically how socioeconomic issues would have been involved specifically in Galilee. Why a Jew standing in the Jewish prophetic tradition really would come forward, would be, a poster boy for this movement, right? I didn't mean that in any sort of negative way, but just looking at the socioeconomic issue there for an emergence of a movement specifically in the region of Galilee, lots of archaeological finds to undergird that, right? But also, so putting these together, Jesus' take on the law, and then his concern for the rich to repent before it's too late. So I'm pausing because I'm thinking about the elements that I wonder if Crossley still agrees with. So hang with me. So here's one of his comments or his claims about how he is reading all of these pieces that are familiar to you all. So I'm quoting from him: Jesus's mission to sinners, however you fill in what that is a reference to, right? Do you all think tax collectors and prostitutes, which is really interesting, right? Sex and money, the two, so many things I could say about that. Do you think of religious leaders who are spinning the law to their benefit, letter of the law to their benefit instead of the spirit of the law? Like, who do you think of when you think of Jesus's mission to sinners? Who do you think of, right? Because I don't think that his mission to sinners was to the general public, right? He was speaking on behalf of the general public to the leadership who are the sinners, and right in the issue, the socioeconomic exploitation, this issue that's going on. So his mission to sinners, but that's my interpretation of things and isn't necessarily what Crossley is getting at here. So his mission to sinners was a crucial link to the emergence of a notable association with Gentiles, because structurally, so socially, right, perceptions of Jewish sinners were close to perceptions of Gentiles. We see that rhetorically, right, that Gentile sinners. We see the othering. Let me just boil it down to that, right? Keep it simple for now. The othering that happens in lots of religious traditions, or in political, social spaces where we need to define an us and them, or when the belief is there that we need to do that. Those who are our enemies, I don't like using some of this language, but right, the negative association, the sinner. Okay, so this issue, this made it possible. So here's the fourth piece in his conversation, or his observations: the rise of monotheism in agrarian societies, which did begin in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE. So that shift to actual monotheism and not henotheism. So henotheism is we're only worshiping one God, but we believe that others exist. And in fact, we're going to make it really clear in the things we say that we do believe there are other gods out there, and we are only going to worship this one God, and shame on you for worshiping those others. To there is only one God, right? So the shift to, or the rise in this belief, the rise of monotheism in agrarian societies may be linked to the spread of a universalistic and monotheistic Jewish movement in the ancient world, with a shift towards a greater emphasis on fictive kinship. Most of the Newer Testament, not most of, I'm sorry, a good bit of Newer Testament scholarship, in this realm talks about families and fictive families, why the language of families is become so important in the early Christian movement, early churches. The adaptation of family relationships or labels, actually. I mean, thank you, Paul. I mean, I can say thank you, Paul, on that one, right? Because Paul's writings come before the Gospels, and Paul's concept of talking about the sons inherit what the Father has, and that kind of language. So we have all these pieces set up, and this is the one that makes me rethink the way I teach, right? This isn't new to any of you, but the changes happen, right? Changes to key beliefs emerge when adapting to new social settings. And so here we go. This is his commentary about the social reason for allowing non-law observant people in. Once Gentile friends of friends of friends started to join the Christian movement. In other words, for me, I need to think of it backwards than I had previously. Once they were there, those coming to the meetings really didn't care about the law or the issues of the law. And this is why I point out that this particular scholar comes into Newer Testament studies that way. He didn't care about the church because he didn't grow up in it. And so he can see things differently than those of us who grew up in it do. And so he's seeing this, right? So now that there are people here who don't care about the law, right? Then there's a larger pool of people connected to the movement who aren't being justified by works of the law. So now we have to deal with it. And that is what makes, in his suggestion, his estimation of things, that is what makes the need for Paul and his mission. And I do wonder if this is 14 years old now, so I do wonder if he's moved on this particular stance. because I tend to talk about Christian origins as more Paul's doing than Paul facilitating it. I think of it more as Paul making this really interesting aha connection with different ideas from Jewish scripture, and then taking this idea, this epiphany, to the masses. But I find this really compelling. I find this observation kind of flipping it a little bit on its head. All of these, and so the chapter on the socioeconomic issue in this book is really quite compelling, I think. And it's, for me, Crossley is much more, it's much more bite. I don't know how to say it. I feel like he gets it more, like when you have someone who's never experienced poverty trying to write about poverty, that's what it sounds like from most of these white guys who've been writing about socioeconomics in the first century. But you got someone who understands poverty writing about poverty in the first century, and it sounds more realistic. It's more connected. Am I making sense? The scholars who are talking about it haven't ever experienced it. So it's much more heady than heart. And I find myself wanting to help people connect to the heart of the socioeconomic exploitation and crisis. So there may not be anything new for you in that. I don't know. Let me make sure that's not something else that okay, back to you all. Keith and Jonathan.
I want to make a comment about fictive kin.
Okay. Do you want me to go back to that?
Because when I taught sociolinguistics courses, that would come up. And in the parts of the Arab world that I've lived in, that's a very real thing. In other words, when you need to deal with a woman on the street who's older and you don't know her, you say, my aunt, oh, my aunt, can you tell me where the post office is? Mm. And if there's a male that you don't know who's about your age, you refer to him as your brother. Hmm. And it's always my brother. It's not brother, it's my brother. And of course, in Muslim communities, people refer to brother and sister all the time. Hmm. And I've taught graduate students from cultures where what Western anthropologists have called fictive kin is simply part of daily life. And they really object to that label.
To the fictive kin label?
The notion that it is purely a fiction.
Ah!
In other words, while they may not see themselves as being kin, but actually genetically, they do say, look, there is some sense of kinship here that I don't see, for example, most Americans having with one another. Or when I lived in Britain, I didn't experience it there. And so I found it very interesting in my dealings with grad students who were from places where this was simply part of life, that they immediately understood this and the role it played, but they didn't like the label that Western anthropologists had placed on it, because they think that to label it fictive is to somehow make it less real, when for them it is very, very real.
Yeah. I like that.
Pass it on.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's quite rich. I'm also thinking about one of the things I was reading in Burton Mack's kind of introduction on the Christian myth, which, he refers to storytellers, and had a conversation with a Navajo storyteller who was asked, well, how do you know if this is a story, or if it's history, or if it's just, he's like, it's true because we tell the story. That's how I know it's true, because we tell the story. Like, it just is, right? Like this relationship that I'm identifying with this person as my brother. That is what makes it that. And the way we behave then, because I've made that claim.
When in a situation like that, I mean, I'm thinking particularly about North Africa when I lived there. Of course, there's a lot of sex segregation in daily life. Mm-hmm. But if I go up to a woman and I say, oh, my aunt, or even, oh, my sister, she immediately knows I'm not going to hassle her.
You're safe. Mm-hmm.
In other words, that sets up certain kinds of expectations about the social relationship that exists between the people who use that language with one another. And the same thing, like, for example, using diminutives, talking to people, and, like, oh, my little, or oh, my dear, that is often part of the grammar of these languages. Whereas in English, these are separate words. It's not necessarily the case in some other languages.
Mm-hmm.
So they may not like the term fictive, but it's still a social construction.
Right. Right. Yeah, they're aware it's a social construction, but fiction devalues it.
Demeans it is what I was thinking, but devalues, undermines it.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I really do. This language is worth reconsidering. Are there other comments, any other observations, or even feedback? If you want to stay after this class, since it is 8:30, I need to let you all go. If there's any kind of feedback you want to give me for looking ahead, I'm fine. I'm happy to, any other conversations to be had, please. Yeah, Carolyn, please speak up.
Okay, I really appreciate the conversation that you and Keith had. I know he's had a lot of experience in like North Africa and the Middle East. I've had some experience in the Middle East, but probably more experience with Native Americans, and what he was saying, about his cultural experiences is true with my experience with Native Americans, where their definition of kinship is much different than ours. And I think, Americans, ours are so arbitrary, and in other cultures, they're much more expansive. And like in the Navajo culture and the Plains culture, your aunts and uncles are like your moms and dads. And so your cousins are like siblings. And so like my namesake, Carolyn, who is a Navajo, she talks about her grandchildren. Well, she doesn't physically have any grandchildren in the American sense of kinship, but the grandchildren she talks about are her sister's children, who are very much her grandchildren in that tradition. And, it really expands family and relationships in a way that I think would enrich a lot of Americans' lives.
I hear you. Harriet, please.
Well, I just want to echo what Carolyn is saying. When I was growing up, there were very close friends of my parents that we called, Aunt Mary Lou, Uncle John, on and on. And my two little way too cute grandchildren do the same with their parents' close friends. And I'm sure it's not as, well, I can't say I'm sure, I'm guessing it's not as intense as what Keith and Jonathan have experienced and what Carolyn has experienced in First Nation in this country. But it's a desire. Our country is so focused on the nuclear family. And of course, there's so many that major pieces of the nuclear family are cut off, are adrift, are missing, are unknown. I want to go back to the Gentiles who were drawn to Christianity. And of course, Paul has to make a decision, a declaration about keeping the law and circumcision and all of that. It seems to me that as Christianity is developing, is that the strict observance of all the 813 laws is no longer central. It's certainly, it's part of Judaism, but it isn't essential to Christianity. Is that making some sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think I'm just I think part of what I was trying to introduce this evening was to invite us to try to take off our goggles, our Christian goggles,
Right.
and think more about how social groups form and become larger.
Right.
And that if what Jesus was talking about was, he was angry about taxation. If he's angry about taxation and exploitation of the poor, that appeals to everybody who's being exploited and overtaxed. Let's not even talk about laws. Let's not even talk about the 613. That's not even on the, that's not a thing, right? Let's just, agrarian peoples being overtaxed and exploited, and they resonate with this guy over here because he's saying what's going on. That is what draws a crowd. That is what makes your friends and friends and friends, friends of friends of friends, come to this gathering.
Wouldn't you have to have a close examination of life in the Roman Empire and look at the class stratification and the social economic situation of people living in the Roman Empire at the time? And yeah, what happened to the Jews and the Gentiles and all the different classes, and how poverty brought them together as a community. And that's how the early Christian church, it gave rise to the early Christian church.
Yes, all these various factors are important. They are all playing into the picture. Mm-hmm. I think, what when I started out by that slide that said, it's interesting that Christian scholars have actually kept us from being honest.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's the Christian lens that filters, that without even realizing it, colors what we're seeing and how we're teaching our children and preaching from the pulpit. That's the element, right? That's the element I was mostly trying to kind of shed a new light on.
A little bit on that theme. I remember some point, I think it's Stark or saying, and you asked about Jews born into the law that kind of got away from it. And this isn't, I don't mean them, but there were women who married Roman soldiers. And the women got converted to Christianity, and the women had the babies, and the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. So that was part of it. Jesus convinced a lot of women. And I think that's kind of interesting. And possibly, the Roman gods were human. They were supposed to be gods, but they sure had human failings, and they were pretty darn tough. And Jesus came along with a different kind of message, and it was appealing to women. That's what I learned.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Harriet, did you need to chime in?
Yes, Janet. In early church history class, Dr. Shepherd would talk about this queen, of very small areas in what is now Great Britain, was a Christian, and she married this non-believer and converted him. So this happened again and again.
And their children. Their 8 children.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I do need to wrap this up. We're at 8:40. I appreciate you coming this evening. I hope it was a good distraction.